So the last video that I showed you got interrupted by a phone call that I received from a friend that told me that another friend of mine had a pretty bad accident cutting a tree down. Well, nevertheless, hopefully you finished watching that video, and this is going to complete it. I couldn't figure out how to add this one to the end of it, so I figured I'd just send them both to you. And when I concluded that last video, I was talking about the fourth of four components of aggregate demand. The first component was consumption. The second component was gross investment. The third component was government spending. And the fourth component was the spending of foreigners. And I was talking a little bit about how foreigners buy goods and services or demand goods and services that are produced in the United States. And that's a part of the total demand for American goods and services. Now, that foreign demand, however, is tempered by American demand for foreign goods. So what we do is the same thing we do when we look at GDP determination. We come up with something called net exports, right? So we look at the demand of foreigners for American goods, and then the demand of Americans for foreign goods, and we subtract one from the other, and we get a category called net exports, or X sub n. And so we add all the demand, which is similar to GDP, right? Because we add all the demand together, the demand by consumers, the demand by businesses, the demand by government, the demand by foreigners, less the demand of Americans for foreign products together, and we get the total demand for goods and services. And that's represented by a formula. Now, I don't know, I don't know how well you can see that. And obviously not very well, but this is C plus I plus G plus X sub n equals AD. That's aggregate demand. C plus I sub G plus G plus X sub n equals aggregate demand. Right? Now you could put numbers on those. You could say, well, C is 100 and I is 20 and G is 40 and X sub n is 10, and you would get a numeric value. And you can get a numeric value for total demand, right? So that total demand for goods and services. Now, if you're looking in your book and you're reviewing this, you see aggregate demand reflected as a downward sloping curve, right? And on one axis, on the vertical axis of the illustration of aggregate demand, there's PL, or price level. And on the horizontal axis, there's output. Right? So the aggregate demand curve slopes downward, and at a particular price level, right, whatever, PL1, let's say, there's so much aggregate demand at that price level, so much output demanded. And that would be the amount of C plus I sub G plus G plus X sub n demanded at that price level, right? That's what you would see. So if you see that illustration in your book, with a horizontal line, right, that's labeled PL, or price level, and a vertical line, and a horizontal line that's labeled output, and then a downward sloping curve labeled aggregate demand, and you pick any point on that curve, it's going to tell you the amount of demand, aggregate demand at that price level. Now, in your textbook, it talks about why that curve slopes downward. And it gives you three reasons. It says, well, one reason is called the real balances effect, and the foreign purchases effect, is another one of those reasons, and the interest rate effect is another one of those reasons. I wouldn't worry a whole lot about that. I think more important is if you pick any point on that curve at a price level, and you say, okay, this is the amount of demand that there'll be at that price level. If you held that price level constant, a bigger question is, what could cause that demand to increase or decrease autonomously from a change in price level? So if the price level stays the same, and there's $500,000 worth of total demand, what could happen in the economy for there to be $600,000 at that price level? Or $400,000 at that price level, which would in essence shift the entire curve. And that's a pretty big deal, right now. One way to kind of get a sense of that is to go back to the components: consumption, investment, government, and net exports, and talk just briefly about what are the major determinants of the amount of investment spending, the amount of consumption, the amount of government, and the amount of net exports. In terms of consumption, the biggest determinant of how much consumers want to spend, how much they demand, unquestionably the biggest determinant is their income. That's a very important relationship in economics between income and consumption. In fact, if you go back 2 chapters in your book, there's a lengthy discussion of it. You're probably going to have to go back there at some point anyways. But that's the biggest criteria for how much people want to spend. I mean, how much do they demand? Well, the demand that the consumers have is a function of the income they have to buy that demand. That's the biggest determinant. Second biggest determinant is their expectations. What do they expect to be true of the future? You can't see a better example of that than what you see happening now. I mean, consumers are buying lots of groceries and other things because they expect them. They have an expectation they might not be able to get them, right? So the behavior of consumers is usually a function primarily of their income, but also of their expectations. Right? Business investment is usually a function. Now, there are other things too. If you read your book, you'll see there are other things that determine consumption. There are other things that determine gross investment as well. But the 2 big things are interest rates, real interest rates. How much does it cost you to borrow money in order to buy capital, right? I mean, when you talk about buying machinery or expanding a factory or something, which would be a capital expenditure, how much does it cost you to get the money in order to do that? To rent the money to do that. The interest rate, right? Lower interest rates, firms tend to invest more. Higher interest rates, they tend to invest less. But in addition to that, expectations affect firms too. I mean, I can't imagine firms are spending a lot on capital right now because they don't expect the future to be bright. Government is really something that's determined by the whim and the will of government. I mean, they're spending a lot now because there's a crisis. But there's no reliable measures of government spending. Reliable determinants of government spending. Net exports is a function generally of exchange rates, which you talked about in class. If the dollar is weak, right, then foreigners are going to want to buy more American products because American products are going to be less expensive to them. If the dollar's strong, then they're going to want to buy less. That's typically the way it goes. And then the prosperity. If Japan is prospering, then they want to buy more American products. If America is prospering, we want to buy more foreign products, right? So those are the major criteria, and I shouldn't say criteria, that's not the right word, determinants of the components of demand, right? Now, those are important because when aggregate demand changes autonomously from price level, there typically is an impact in the economy. A decline in demand is usually what leads to recessions. An increase in demand is usually what leads to demand pull inflation. So an understanding of what might affect demand is really important to kind of explaining the business cycle, explaining why the economy is where it's at. So take a look at those components and focus on those. If you go back in your book, there's going to be more. There are going to be more determinants than the ones that I gave you, but those are the big ones, right? And look at shifts in demand, right? Look at how the demand curve shifts as a result of some of those things to get a sense of it. Now, the next time I talk with you, I'll talk about aggregate supply. Hopefully this was helpful.